robot grandmas, underground civilizations, aliens, and Carl. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome to the Lore Lodge. Located in Northern California, also known as the good part of California, Mount Shasta is an ancient volcano with a storied past. Many of those stories involve underground civilizations and the idea that the Lemurians, after the sinking of Lemuria, that's just Atlantis 2.0, I guess. But anyway, they went and hid in the mountain. But that's a myth brought by, white people. So we're going to focus on the indigenous stuff for this one because they're more fun, honestly. Like, Lemuria, come on, guys. Come on. Mud flood? Really? Anyway, Mount Shasta sits at the southern tip of the Cascades mountain range, and it is actually the second highest mountain in that range after Mount Rainier in Washington, which we will get to in another video. Shasta sits within the Shasta Trinity National Forest, which was established first as the Shasta National Forest and then the Trinity National Forest in 1905, before the government went, you know what, one is better than two, and made them into one thing. Average temperatures on Mount Shasta range from about 85 degrees in the summer, like July, down to about 45 degrees in the winter months, such as December. Now, in the summer, it's actually quite dry there, but in the winter, there's pretty heavy precipitation. And the mountain itself, being over 14,000 feet tall, possesses on its own 7 glacier fields, and a very large glacial canyon that currently does not possess a glacier, so it's just kind of, a lonely little thing. And the mountain has its little friend, buddy, off to the side, Shastina, which is on its own, I believe, the 4th tallest mountain in the Cascades range. So it's kind of like a little, you get like Shasta's up here, and that's like, shloop. But before we get into the actual missing 411 cases that we're going to be discussing today, I want to give you guys some of the history of the Mount Shasta region, the Klamath Indian people that live around it, and yes, I am using the terminology that I got off of the Bureau of Indian Affairs website, so don't sue me. The story of Mount Shasta has to start with the Klamath Indians. They are the regional tribal group that makes up the majority of the area around the mountain, and they have a history dating back at least 7,000 years. In terms of mainline accepted archaeology, the United States and Canada and Mexico have been inhabited by the Native American peoples we know today since about 13,000 years ago, but recent suggestions are that there were probably populations before that, but at the very least, the current population seems to be derived from the Clovis culture of about 13,000 years ago. The first Europeans to make contact with the Klamath people were from the Hudson's Bay Company, which is, of course, a old company that was trapping and fishing and all of that up in northern Canada. In 1826, European Canadians made contact with the Klamath and quickly introduced things like cattle ranching, herding, and modern lumber practices to them. And the Klamath just went with it. They exploded. They were an extraordinarily successful group of people. They took these new practices and managed to both hang on to their old way of life and their legends, their traditions, and all of that, but become a genuine economic powerhouse in the region. But eventually, as more and more white Americans moved into the area, conflicts arose. There was a lot of land out there, and the Klamath, while they had certain treaties here and there, did not have the numbers to really resist American encroachment. So, after several conflicts, eventually a treaty was reached. The Klamath would cede 23 million acres of land to California and Oregon. In exchange, the United States paid $115,000 or $2,169,405 in today's money to the Klamath people. They would also be responsible for infrastructure and reservation staffing. But for the first 15 years, $80,000 of that $115,000 was going to be paid out over time, and there were certain rules. For example, the Native Americans were not allowed to keep intoxicating liquors on the presence of the reservation or drink them. So they had to be like a dry reservation for 15 years, which I could not find any sort of legitimate reasoning for. It just kind of seemed like the Americans were being dumb. If this drinking law was violated, payments could be withheld. Now, it's entirely possible that the whole idea behind giving them this stipulation was that alcohol would make its way onto the reservation and the United States could then renege on their deal to pay out money to this tribal group. Now, if you're wondering why the Klamath kind of accepted this very lopsided agreement, there were only about 2,000 of them. They really had no ability to resist, and the deal they were getting worked out well enough. 23 million acres is a lot of land that they simply didn't have the population to farm. But they definitely got the raw end of the deal here. They also were able to, through this treaty, retain their hunting, fishing, and gathering rights in perpetuity, which meant on their remaining land, nobody could argue with them. They had the rights to that, which for them at the time, I suppose, was good enough. As we've seen with most of American history, it's a lot of the United States government making deals that today we look at as not in the best interest of the Native American population. But then in 1954, the United States government did something else. Congress proposed a set of termination acts, and what these did was terminate the special rights, privileges, and recognition that certain Native American groups got, and they based this on a number of criteria, but involved in this was, are they self-sufficient? Have they adapted into European American culture? You know, basically, like, do these people need recognition as Native American states anymore, or have they gotten to a point where they either don't need our protection or they're not recognizable as natives? And against the recommendations of the Klamath themselves, as well as the Bureau of Indian Affairs and most politicians in the region, Congress did in fact pass this act. This stripped the tribe of their reservation, of their special rights and privileges, of their funding, basically of everything that was keeping the Klamath way of life going. And this was devastating. It took away all sorts of access to very, very necessary resources. And eventually, in 1986, the Reagan administration would get around to fixing this and restoring their rights and privileges. But it was a long road. It took about 30 years, and it was not fair to the people. And in case you were wondering if there was some sort of partisanship here, the Democrats opposed the initial Termination Act, and then the Republicans proposed the Restoration Act. The Republicans giveth and the Republicans taketh away. Now, of course, immediately after the Termination Act, the government went and said, oh my God, look at all this empty land. I wonder where the people went. Let's make a national park. And thus, Shasta Trinity National Forest was born. But the Klamath didn't actually leave. They're still there, and now they have their reservation, and they've maintained a lot of their cultural norms and traditions. Among those, their folklore, which is beautiful. I just bought a book on it because I wanted to read up on more of it. I highly recommend it. I will link it in the description so you guys can buy it yourselves. I can't remember the exact title off the top of my head, but I'm going to link it for you. According to Klamath tradition, Mount Shasta was created by the Old Man in the Sky, who is a god figure of their mythology, and he wanted to come down to Earth, which was flat and didn't have any mountains, and there was no way for him to get from up there to down here. So he dripped snow and ice and rock down until eventually a mountain formed that was high enough that he could come down and go onto the Earth. The Old Man in the Sky then creates life on Earth, the trees, the plants, the animals, and then he gets to the grizzly bears, and he really overdoes himself on the grizzly bears because it gets to the point where the grizzly bears actually scare him, and he hollows out the mountain to make a teepee out of it, and then he goes and lives in the mountain, and the Klamath say that for 7,000 years, basically, you could see smoke rising from the Old Man in the Sky's teepee inside of the mountain. And then when the white men came, the smoke stopped. Now, much of this is attributed to Mount Shasta being a volcano that most recently erupted around 7,000 years ago. So today, many of these stories and traditions are looked back on as describing volcanic eruptions and volcanic activity within Mount Shasta, which is a volcano. Volcano. In Klamath folklore, humans were actually created when the daughter of the Old Man in the Sky, Little Daughter, poked her head out the top of the teepee and was swept away by the wind, flown down the mountain, and taken in by a family of grizzly bears. And at the time, in their stories, the grizzly bears walked on two legs, they carried clubs, and they spoke. They had a language. So the little daughter actually ends up marrying the son of one of the grizzly bears, and they have children together, but because Little Daughter is a god and the grizzly bears are not humans, their children turn out to be humans. Eventually, the mother of the grizzly bear, the mother-in-law of Little Daughter at this point, decides, you know what, we should probably tell the Old Man in the Sky what happened to his daughter. They send messengers up, they tell Old Man in the Sky, he comes down, he's really mad, he takes his daughter back up the mountain, and he's like, all right, you grizzlies, you've betrayed me, now you will walk on all fours and you will no longer speak. Thus, we ended up with, modern grizzly bears. There's many other stories, but I wanted to at least tell that one because it has to do with the creation of the mountain itself and the creation of the human race. But now we're going to get into these modern stories, and we're going to start with one that was probably one of the first Missing 411 stories I ever heard, and it's the story about the robot grandma, because we're just departing entirely from all normalcy. This is going to be one of those episodes. Get ready. For the robot grandma story, I want to point a few things out before we get into it. Names have all been redacted, not by me, by the original source of the story, David Paulides. Paulides says that the family that was involved came to him, told him the story, but wanted their names redacted for anonymity. So there's no names here. There's no way to corroborate it, which means you've got to you got to decide how much you trust David Paulides on this one. But I'm still going to tell you the story in case it does happen to be true. On October 1st, 2010, a family of 4 was camping on Mount Shasta. Around 6 p.m., the 3.5-year-old toddler and the sister of unspecified age were sitting out by the fire. The sister turned away to look in another direction for a couple of seconds. Maybe she heard a sound. It's not really specified. And then when she turned back, her brother was gone. The family immediately launched a search. They got the help of the forest rangers, and they started looking all over the place. And from about 6:30 p.m. to 12:30 p.m., they were just combing everywhere that the boy could possibly be. And then, around 12:15, 12:30 in the morning, the dogs came across the boy. They were able to locate his scent. He was hiding in a bush on the side of a trail that they had been over numerous times, as most of these stories go. And then, everyone was just happy that he was found safely. They took him back to the camp. They all had a nice happy reunion. But a couple of months later, the boy was staying with his grandmother. She was babysitting, and he said to her, "I don't like the other Cappy." And Cappy was what he allegedly called his grandmother, whose name was Kathy. And she asked, "Well, what do you mean the other Cappy? What does that mean?" And he said something along the lines of, "Don't you remember when I was lost on the mountain?" And she's like, sure. And he's like, "Oh, well, the other Cappy came, and she took me to a cave, and the cave had lots of spiders and guns and purses," which is, it's a 3.5-year-old, remember that, so we're likely not getting accurate descriptions. What could that mean? Purses could just be bags. The guns one, I don't know. But, and then the spiders thing, I was racking my brain trying to think, what could that mean? And I really could not come up with anything other than, like, tripods for a camera, maybe? And he described this other Cappy as being robotic, as shimmering in the light and having just these features that did not match human beings, but she looked exactly like Cappy. And then he said there were other robots too, but they weren't moving, like they were turned off. Now, if we're going to assume this is a true story, robots seems unlikely because, if Elon Musk and Boston Dynamics and all of them can't do it yet, I highly doubt that there was some fully functional robot just vibing on Mount Shasta in 2010. And he said that this robot told him that he had come from outer space and been implanted in his mother's stomach. Well, tummy was the word he used. And that they also needed to collect a stool sample, and that the robot Cappy had held out a sticky piece of paper to collect the sample. So he didn't say stool sample, obviously, but I'm going to use terminology that's not gross. And then after this series of pokes and prods and attempted stool sample collections, the robot took him back down the mountain and told him to hide under a bush until he was found. Now, the grandmother went on to say that the way that he described this was not so much a robot as what she perceived to be like a hologram, even though he said it was a robot. And likely she would have chalked this up to just an imaginative 3-year-old, kids, gets lost for a little while, comes up with some incredible story to explain it because he can't quite comprehend what happened to him. But the grandmother had her own weird experience on Mount Shasta a year earlier, which prompted her to call the boy's father and explain what had been said. The boy's father corroborated that he had heard the same story but also chalked it up to nothing. But the grandmother was worried because when she was camping on Mount Shasta a year prior, she had something happen that she couldn't explain. She and a friend were up there. She was sleeping in a tent, he was sleeping in a camper, and they were sitting out by the fire late at night, and they saw red eyes peering out of the wilderness at them. And every time that they would shine their flashlight at the eyes, they would disappear. And throughout the night, the eyes kept popping up in various positions around their campsite until eventually they just decided, you know what, I'm tired, I want to go to bed. And then in the morning, both Cappy, and her friend woke up on the ground outside of their tent and camper. Now, Cappy felt around in the back of her neck and felt that she had what felt like 2 small puncture marks, like a spider bite. And when she went to check on her friend, he too had 2 small puncture marks. They both felt very sick, like extremely hungover or drained. even though they hadn't been drinking. And they just assumed, we were probably just bitten by like a poisonous spider or something. Which makes complete sense. It's a totally reasonable assumption, but you factor in what the little boy said and you gotta wonder. And so that's apparently why the story was told. Now, what are some possibilities? Well, if the stories are true, maybe up on Mount Shasta, there is some sort of mad scientist or witch doctor or something like that who is, taking people and poking and prodding and experimenting and collecting stool samples and all of that. And a child you can just easily enough take. But 2 grown adults, you would probably have to sedate them first, so maybe that's what the puncture marks are from. But again, no names, foggy dating, you decide if you believe this story. But there is a story that was covered by the news, and we're going to talk about that one next. The story of Carl Landers. Carl Landers was a 69-year-old man. He was hiking Mount Shasta with a couple of his friends, and as you can imagine, you know where this story is going. On May 25th, 1999, Carl and 2 of his buddies were attempting to summit Mount Shasta, which, again, it is an over 14,000 foot tall mountain. That is not a simple task. It's quite a hike. But Carl was up to the challenge. Carl had already summited 57 of the highest peaks in California. He was on a mission to summit the highest mountain in every single county of the state. There's a lot of mountains in the state of California. So he had done 57 of 58. Mount Shasta was his last one, and it wasn't even the tallest. So as you can imagine, Carl was an extremely experienced hiker. He was very skilled. He knew what he was doing. So when Carl took Barry Gilmore and Milton Gaines up the mountain with him, ages 60 and 64 respectively, nobody thought things were going to go awry. They all thought, you know what, this is going to be a normal routine trip. On the night of May 24th, the trio had camped at Camp 5050 because they wanted to adjust to the altitude before heading up to Helen Lake, another campsite a couple thousand feet up the mountain. Now, Carl, while definitely in good shape and definitely experienced, was suffering from a little bit of altitude sickness at this point, because as you get up into those mountains, you start to have a lot less oxygen available, you're exerting yourself, so it gets a little bit harder to breathe, and you just start to have symptoms that make you feel ill. So when everyone woke up on the morning of May 25th, Carl just kind of went, I'm not feeling great, I'm probably going to be lagging behind all day. You know what, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get a head start so that you guys can just catch up to me. So that morning he left Camp 5050, which sits at an elevation of 9,280 feet, that is 2,828 meters, for Helen Lake, which sits at about 10,400 feet or 3,170 meters. This day, it would have been slightly cooler than the sea level temperature of about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 degrees Celsius. And when I looked back at the weather history, there was no rain, very low winds, and the weather conditions were listed as fair. Now, in the winter, this area is very snowy. It's just a field of snow and ice. But in the summer and the late spring, it's pretty green and open, just not a ton of vegetation at this kind of elevation. And Helen Lake, up at 10,400 feet, is a very good spot for trout fishing, apparently. Carl was well prepared. He was wearing at least 2 layers, most likely 3, which for this elevation, this time of year, was completely appropriate. These included a rust-colored coat, ski pants, and boots with crampons on them. For those of you who didn't see the last video where we mentioned crampons are basically spikes that attach to your boot, and they help you climb up rocky and icy surfaces. Along with his clothing, he was also carrying a backpack, which was outfitted with both food and water, at the very least enough to get him to Helen Lake. Lake Helen somewhere else. Yes, I did discover that Lake Helen is somewhere else while researching for this, because I kept trying to find Lake Helen on Mount Shasta and could not do so because there isn't one. There's a Helen Lake. And like I said, at this point in the climb, there's very little brush. There's a few trees here and there, but for the most part, in the summer, you're looking at what is essentially just a straight shot up a couple thousand feet, weaves here and there a little bit, but it's basically just a grassy field with a bunch of rocks on it. There is no way going from Camp 5050 to Lake Helen for you to accidentally get off trail. There is no way to do that. It is open, and it is basically a mile in either direction to get to a spot that you could get lost in. It's just a straight shot. I cannot emphasize that enough. There's no known crevices, there's no offshoots of the trail, there's no caves, there is nowhere to get lost between Camp 5050 and Helen Lake. There's nowhere. Nonetheless, when Milton and Gaines made their way up to Helen Lake, there was no Carl. Now, some versions of this story that you hear might say that they found Carl's backpack, or they found Carl's jacket, or something like that. I could not find a single shred of evidence that either of those things is true, which is why I do all of the research for these myself. This is why people watch these videos all the time. They're like, oh, you're using David Paulides' work. Why aren't you crediting him? Because I didn't use his work. I do the research myself. I read the news reports. I read the weather reports. So I just, want to make that clear to anybody, to any of my doubters. But yeah, there's no mention in any of the news articles that are contemporary with it of his backpack being found, of his coat being found, any of that. Essentially, Carl goes up the mountain and just vanishes. His clothes, his supplies, everything gone. A search was launched that afternoon, which included both the U.S. Forest Service and the National Guard. For those of our viewers who are not in the United States, our National Guard is essentially our state militaries that we have. They are part-time. They are citizen soldiers. They're basically around for this kind of thing, for search and rescue, homeland defense, natural disasters, and then also making up 70% of casualties in Iraq. So both the National Guard and the state police contributed helicopters. Those helicopters had infrared sensors. And again, remember, we are scanning what is essentially just an open rock face. There is nowhere to get lost. If he was on that mountain and slightly warm, the infrared sensors would have picked him up. The next morning, 50 people, including rangers and volunteers, hiked up the mountain to look for him, and they combed everything. They checked under every rock for this man, and there was just no sign of him. And since it wasn't winter, there were no tracks. There wasn't anything to see. One ranger did say that he did speak to a lone older gentleman on Saturday afternoon between Camp 5050 and Helen Lake, but he could not confirm if this was or was not Carl. And importantly, Carl's destination was Helen Lake. He wasn't like, all right, we'll head up in the direction of Helen Lake, and then, you guys will catch up to me somewhere between, and I'll keep going. No, it was they're going to Helen Lake. That was the end of the trip. That was where they were supposed to be rendezvousing before making any other moves. So the fact that Carl was not at Helen Lake means one of two things. Either he deliberately wandered off, which there was no motive for doing so, and as we know, he was on a mission. He was trying to summit all 58 peaks in California, the highest peak in every county. That was the goal. So he was very close. He was not going to just walk off the trail and give up and go home. This was not some sort of suicide mission for him where he was just going to wander off into the wilderness. He had a good life. He had a family. That was not on the table. There also was no motive for any foul play. It wasn't believed that either of Carl's friends had any reason to harm him or any reason to lie. And if they were going to do something to him, why wait until after Camp 5050 where there's absolutely nowhere to stash a body? It just doesn't make any sense. That means that Carl himself would have had to deliberately go off course or be taken off course. But since nobody was seen taking him off course and nobody found any sign of him, no sign of a struggle, no torn clothes, nothing, it seems very unlikely that a person tried to grab this man, who again, we're talking about open rock face. If you scream, it's going to be really easy to hear you. There was no evidence that anybody took this man anywhere. He just vanished. So what happened to Carl? Well, this is one of those cases that every time I start to doubt myself, if there's something weird going on, if maybe these are cases where somebody just got off track, got off course, I find one of these where what we're looking at is there is no feasible way for this guy to disappear. The cops ruled out foul play, and the infrared sensors did not find him, and to this day, 12 years later, no body has been found. How does somebody just simply vanish from a clearly marked trail in an area without trees? There was nowhere to hide. He just was gone. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I have an explicit reason why or a theory as to what took him. Have there been UFO sightings on Mount Shasta? Absolutely. Are they credible? Anyone's guess. The Pentagon did just admit a couple years ago that, we have had actual UFO sightings, so that's questionable. You want to believe, maybe he shifted into another dimension somehow? Maybe that. Maybe there is something that prowls the mountains of our national parks, snatching people up. Maybe this is where we get the legend of things like the Wendigo. Or maybe we just don't know. And sometimes that's the scariest thing to admit with these kinds of things. We don't know everything that's out there. We don't know every law of physics. We don't even know if we're alone in the universe. So, will we ever know what happened to Carl? Probably not, unless a body is found, and then maybe we can begin to construct some sort of story. But in this case, as it stands, you gotta wonder. And interestingly enough, out of these two stories about Mount Shasta, I think it's the Carl Landers story that's the more mysterious, because it involves a concrete set of facts. There is a person named Carl Landers. That person was last seen at Camp 5050, possibly then seen again somewhere up the mountain. So, I mean, if that ranger did see Carl, then that seals it. His friends were not responsible for his disappearance. And if his friends weren't responsible for his disappearance, there is literally no other possible option. And I'm not trying to lay blame on them. I'm not trying to say that they did anything. I'm just saying in the event that the argument is, all right, well, maybe this was a cover-up. Maybe his friends murdered him and stowed his body somewhere for whatever reason. Again, there was no possible motive for that anyone could determine. So that I don't think that's what happened. So if that ranger did see him, that means his friends weren't responsible. It wasn't foul play. And if he just slipped and hit his head, the IR sensors would have found him, especially if he was on the trail when it happened. And there's no wildlife up there to chase you off the trail. So as far as missing 411 cases go, I think this is one of the most baffling ones, because it really does have no good explanation. Now, I would love to do an Into Thin Air style thing where we go and travel there and we talk to the people involved, we talk to the rangers and all of that, but until I get the opportunity to do that, for the first time in a while, I'm gonna file this one as something weird happened. This is one that I'm leaning towards paranormal on. But, of course, we do these videos not because we're trying to tell you how to feel or how to think, but because we're trying to give you guys stories about strange things that happened and lead to discussions and open conversations. So if you've got different ideas, let us know in the comments, or if you agree with us, let us know in the comments. It's nice to feel validated. Also, if you want to support our work, you can check us out on Patreon. We just released a brand new Drunk Folklore video over there. It is 33 minutes long. I sing. It's beautiful. We talk about goblins. We talk about the skunk ape. Aiden and I share an intimate moment. But you want to see this one. So check that out. It's available for just $1 a month over on Patreon. You can also check out our Discord, which is linked in the description below. We also have an Amazon storefront. I will be including the link to that book I mentioned as well in the description. And we have, of course, our card or our Linktree kind of variant where you can catch all of our sponsorships, email address, those kinds of things, and follow us in other places. Also, make sure to check out Tableau Roasting Company because they carry our coffee. Mount Pocono Perk is delicious. I need a new bag. I just used all of mine. So if you're a coffee lover, check that out. It is great for drinking black. It's also great for drinking as a cold brew. Or if you want to put in cream and sugar and just have it that way, totally fine. We wanted to go for something that was mellow enough to be malleable and fun to play with, as well as good enough and intricate enough for you to enjoy it on your own. So absolutely would recommend checking it out. And we also, of course, have our Target sponsorship. If you like Target clothing, you can go and check that out. That link is also in the description. There's a lot of links in there. Just check the description, okay? All right. Anyway, I'm Aiden Mattis. Thanks for stopping by.